Hey guys, how you doing down here? And it's lovely to see you all again. So I'm just out to meet my sister and her partner, and we're going to have a trip up to Ingleton Waterfall trail. Now if you've not been here before, it is an amazing photography location, especially if you're doing long exposure photography, which luckily we are today. So today we're going to have a look at 5 tips and techniques to massively improve your long exposure photography, especially with waterfalls, and especially if you're just starting out. Now we've got a great day for it. We've got blue skies, which is absolutely amazing, a massive contrast to yesterday's shoot, where it was literally just sheet white cloud. It was pretty grim to say the least, and I managed to crack the filter on my lens, which wasn't great, and it got proper stuck on there, so make sure to check that video out, how I got that off. I'll link that above. But guys, I'm just going to grab a coffee and then I will see you at Ingleton Falls very shortly. Thank you. See you later. Right guys, so there's a few things you need when you're going to be doing a long exposure of pretty much anywhere, but waterfalls in particular. You're going to need a sturdy tripod. Now I'd bring with you the tripod which you're most comfortable with carrying for a decent amount of time, especially if you're going up some sort of trail or something like that. You're also going to need a camera, obviously. Now that might be a camera, a drone, or any other sort of camera. It can even be on your phone. There's some apps which do long exposures as well. Now you're going to need some sort of trigger mechanism as well. So this can be either on your phone. When you connect your phone to the camera, you can trigger the shutter, and this just means that there's going to be no shake on the camera when you press the shutter, and that's going to get rid of any shake in the final image as well, which of course we don't want when we're doing a long exposure. Or you can also set a timer on the camera itself, so you can do a 10-second timer or a 2-second timer. So once you press the button, and then the camera will wait that amount of time, settle down, and then take the image. And then finally, there's also a shutter release you can buy for the cameras themselves. So that's like using your phone, but that just plugs in directly to the camera, and then you can just press the shutter button, and you don't even have to touch the camera, and it will set the long exposure going. And finally, for a successful long exposure, you're probably going to need some sort of filters. Now, this is a ring filter, so this is what's currently on my camera now, and this is a variable ND. So if I rotate this, it's going to adjust the exposure, and this is great for reducing the amount of light going into the camera, so you can then set a longer exposure so your scene's not overexposed. We've also got rectangular filters which go into a filter system. So these are the format high-tech ones. So these are really great, and these sit in a filter system which has got a polarizer on it as well. So that'll get rid of any reflections in the scene, which is also really, really great when we're dealing with water. So we've got lots of reflections. And finally, this is a set of ND filters for a drone. So you can also do long exposures on a drone. Now with a drone, it's obviously a little bit more difficult because it's actually in movement, it's in flight, and it can get a little bit wobbly. So actually getting a decent long exposure on a drone is a little bit tricky, but these are ND filters for drones. So that's pretty much all you need for a long exposure. The only other thing really you need is some sort of creativity whilst you're down there, just to make sure you're getting a nice composition of the entire scene. So guys, we're at Thornton Falls now, it's just over there. So we're going to set up down there and hopefully try and find a nice composition. Hopefully it shouldn't be too hard around here. Right, let's try and not fall, slip and break any lenses and filters today. Probably should stop recording really. Say again? But if I go down this time, at least I'll have the footage for You've Been Framed and to show Jenna, yeah. So there it is, just there. So we'll try and find a nice spot just over here so we can get a really, really nice composition of the waterfall. So guys, just before I set up, I'm just going to try and find a nice composition with a phone so I don't have to set all the tripod up and then move it all. So I'm just using a viewfinder app. I'm recording the screen, and I really want to kind of make use of this mossy rock down here. So we're going to try and line up something like this. That's not quite right, but you see I'm at 35mm at the moment, so I'm going to shoot probably around 16 or 20. So I can just put that in on the app, line something up, and something like that actually is looking quite nice. Want maybe a bit So as you see here, the rocks kind of like lead into the waterfall, which looks quite nice. So I'm going to try and go for something like that, and then maybe do another shot just a little bit closer with a bit less of a leading line going in. We just finished at Thornton Force down there. We didn't manage to actually do the tips down there because it was a bit too busy, and I feel like I need a bit of quieter space to go through that, but we'll do that once we get up here a little bit further up the trail. So guys, we're at Beezely Falls now, and I can finally tell you the tips. So as I mentioned earlier, the most important thing is that there is no movement on the camera. That's tip number one, ensure there's no movement. So make sure you've got a sturdy tripod, make sure you've got a sturdy setup, and make sure that when you're pressing the shutter, that there's no shake going into the camera. So there's a few ways of doing this. Like I mentioned earlier, we've got ways of doing it on an app or a phone. So you just tap it on the phone and the shutter releases. Or we've got other ways of doing it with a timer on the shutter. So we've got, if I show you here, we've got a 2-second mode and a 10-second mode here. I tend to find that a 2-second delay is more than enough. That's just enough time for the camera to settle down and remove any vibrations which are there. But making sure there's no movement is the most important thing during a long exposure. You've got to think that the shutter's open for 1, 2, 4, maybe even 30 seconds. So if the camera moves at all during that time, it's going to affect the exposure. If you do this whilst the shutter's open, you're going to end up with some ghosting. Your image might be a little bit soft and it might not look like it's in focus, and you'll end up with a little bit of motion blur. So that's definitely something which we want to avoid. Just with movement, another kind of semi-tip, if you will, is make sure your stabilizer is turned off. If your stabilizer is turned off on the lens or the camera, it might mean that the sensor just slightly wobbles even though it's on a tripod, and this will affect a long exposure as well. So just make sure your stabilizer is off. Another thing to think about is just when you're setting your exposure settings is how long should your shutter be. Now, I think for a scene like this, around 8 seconds is pretty much spot on. But if you want to do it longer or shorter, that's fine. But the length of time which the shutter is open is how much movement there's going to be in the scene. And there's a couple of things which kind of affect this as well. If you're really, really close to a subject or an object, your shutter speed doesn't need to be as slow, because it can enter frame and leave frame quicker, so it can be a shorter exposure. But if you're doing it the other way around and you're being a bit further away from an object, it can have the opposite effect. So you need a slower shutter speed to make sure you're getting absolutely everything entering frame and then leaving frame. So just have a play around with different exposure lengths, and this will be perfect. And you'll kind of settle on one for each scene. Every scene will be totally different. So the next tip and technique is to use an ND filter. So this is a variable ND filter, and I've got one on the front here. And this just allows you to limit the amount of light going into the camera. Because the shutter's open for so long, if you didn't lower the amount of light going into the sensor, it'd just be overblown, and there'd be lots of, overblown white bits in the scene, which we don't want. I'm going to come on to that in a second, but with ND filters, you can get different values. So I've actually just shot this video, and I was using this ND filter, which goes up to ND32, and it wasn't quite enough. But then it turns out my sister's ND filter goes all the way to 2000, so it's ND8 to ND2000. So for this scene, I can now get an 8-second exposure, which is perfect for what I need, because I'm quite far away as well. Just a thing with aperture is you don't want to have your aperture close too much. When you first start doing stuff like this, you can kind of jump into the thing of completely closing your aperture. But once your aperture gets to a point around f18, f20, something called diffraction can start happening. So even though the majority of your scene is in focus, because of the depth of field is nice and wide, is what can happen is diffraction, and that can just kind of soften your image a little bit, which is another thing we obviously want to try and avoid. Now, another thing with exposure, as we're talking ND filters, shutter speed and aperture, is where once you're looking at your scene, if you've got anything what's white, such as water, it might be after the long exposure, it might be blown out. So just have a couple of play arounds with different exposures, different compositions to try and iron that out. Guys, I've got to say as well, this ND filter, so this is the, as I said, this is my sister's, but this is the KF Concept ND8 2000. It's absolutely amazing. I would definitely recommend it, and I'll pop a link down in the description below. But I think everything's ready now. I've got a nice composition, which I'm happy with. My exposure settings are right. In fact, I'm going to knock down to f16. A couple of other things is just, like I said earlier on, make sure your stabilizer is off. Make sure you're in manual focus so you can kind of set where you want your focus to be in the scene, and make sure you're in manual mode as well, just so you've got ultimate control of your exposure. hit the shutter. There we go, I've got a 2-second timer, you can see that up here. And the shutter's now going to open for 8 seconds. And hopefully we're going to end up with a really nice image. Let's just see what we get. There we go, brilliant. I'm happy with that. Just try one more exposure at 6 seconds, just so we've got different options to play with when we come in post. But another thing as well, just make sure you're shooting raw. That way, if you do accidentally kind of blow out your whites just a little bit, you might be able to recover them, which is always great and definitely something to do. I'd always recommend shooting in raw. There we go, I missed that one. Let's just have another look. Yeah, I think I prefer the 6-second exposure to the 8. I might even try a 5. Let's just see what we get. And there we go, I think out of all of them, the 5-second is my favourite. So just have a play around with different exposure lengths, and then you can kind of pick the best one once you get to post-production. Don't be afraid to get different compositions as well. This waterfall here, there's probably 3, 4, 5 really, really strong compositions. You can kind of get your creative juices flowing and just get experimental, play around with a few ideas, and you'll end up with some amazing shots. So guys, I hope you learned something new from this long exposure video. I know there's quite a lot to go over in this, but the more you kind of practice these things, the better you'll get. I challenge you just to go out, get some shots with long exposures and see what you can manage to capture. Now, a couple of things just to kind of really hit home with is don't move the tripod, don't move the camera, make sure stabilization is off, that's all great. And also just think about the exposure length. Just because you can do a 30-second exposure doesn't mean you have to. Capturing 30 seconds of motion in one image is quite a lot. But also think about that on the other end. Is 1 second enough? Is 2 seconds enough? The more times you do these images, the more you'll kind of learn, and you'll start to realize, oh, that's fine. I need a 4-second exposure. But the more you do it, the more you'll kind of learn, and then you'll be going out, getting long exposures, and you'll be nailing it. And think about your other exposure settings. Think about ways of releasing the shutter. Have fun with it. Be creative. Get as many shots, even if they're not great, doesn't matter, try again, you'll end up there. But guys, if you like this video or learned anything new, please remember to like, comment and subscribe to my channel. That'll be amazing, thank you, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Cheers.